passageway. The ramps might be a little slick, so please, if you use them, be really, really careful. We are so pleased that you are all here this evening. Everyone is welcome next door. We have some refreshments next door, and I believe there's some historical material for you to look at, and if you have any questions of anybody, that's a nice time to get together and to talk with one another. So everyone is welcome to join us next door. The beginning of our service this evening is courtesy of Basil and Colleen Brackett, our friends and neighbors, who have been very busy getting historical information together. And they have some really interesting stories about the heritage and the past of this church in this area. So I'm going to turn it over to them.
Okay, thanks, Tom, for having us here tonight. We are so pleased to be here this evening. We live on Friend Road, just east of the church. Our home was previously owned by Blanche and Lee Fitzwater. Our property goes back to Rachel Malin, who was one of the Universal Friend's closest associates. We have done a great deal of research on the Friend Church, the surrounding area, and the families who live here. Our presentation tonight is a result of reviewing many resources, including newspapers, books, and personal discussions with many of Friend's old-timers. We would like to begin by reciting the Little Friend Church, which is a hymn written by Blanche Fitzwater and Gordon Keach in 1944 to commemorate the building of this church. The Little Friend Church, and it's also in your program tonight. The Little Friend Church goes like this. There's a pleasant little valley nestled close among the hills, and the liveliness and beauty fills the heart with sudden thrills. Out across the peaceful valley peals the faithful old church bell, calling all the folk to worship in the tones we love so well. Every Sunday morning early, the church doors open wide. Pastor friends are there already, and a welcome waits inside. Half a century it has stood there in a grove of maple trees, lovely with the snows of winter, cool summer's breeze. Faces mixed and often longed for, hands that toil from day to day, just to keep the church doors open, and are now so far away. Little white church in the valley, peal the notes from out your tower. Let their echo every Sunday across the hills at the church hour.
Thank you, Basil. Thank you, everyone. We found some very valuable information in an interview done with Reverend Clayton Comstock that was written by Brian Serow in 1983. Mr. Serow described the Little Friend Church as sitting 7 miles in a valley, about 1.5 miles from where the pioneer prophetess Jemima Wilkinson, the founder of New Jerusalem, spent her final years. Historical evidence points to the fact that the land on which the present church now stands was the site of an early edifice built by Native Americans or their predecessors. According to Miles Davis, the author of the History of Jerusalem, the structure called the Old Fort was built for some other purpose other than defense in war and belonged to a time of peace and civilization.
Prior to 1857, some 67 years after Jemima Wilkinson settled in the town of Jerusalem, a group of worshipers with Methodist leanings met regularly in private homes in the Old Fort Schoolhouse at Friend. Many of the leaders and families' names, such as Comstock, Sherman, and Keach, are still prominent in the area. You can see them reflected in the local road signs. The first school building was built by Thomas Clark, a member of the Friends household. In 1877, the existing building next door was built by Samuel Andrews. At that time, the little hamlet of Friend consisted of a general store with a meeting room upstairs, a blacksmith shop, a post office, a school, and at the heart of it all was the Little Friend Church.
In speaking with Reverend Comstock, he indicated that of the early settling families, the women were followers of Jemima Wilkinson, but many of the men had Methodist leanings, which I found very interesting. Reverend Comstock also said humorously that this arrangement did not seem to cause any family problems.
The Friend Methodist Episcopal Church was incorporated on December 22nd in 1857.
When I heard this, I kind of thought, what a joyous Christmas it must have been for those people.
This was the first Methodist organization at Friend and formed the basis of organized religion that has to continue for the most part steadily in the community until present time. In 1888, the church that we are standing in was erected by volunteer carpenters Lorenzo Schofield and Aishel Botsford. Lorenzo Schofield is buried across the road in the old Fort Cemetery.
The story I'm about to tell you now is actually one of my favorite stories that I learned when we were researching this. Lorenzo and Aishel were dedicated to the building of this church. History has it that one day they were busy working on the building when they ran out of nails. Penyan was 7 miles away. The weather was inclement and the roads were impassable. They dared not endanger their horses by taking them out in these conditions. Lorenzo and Aishel walked those 7 long miles and back to get those nails. The story doesn't begin there, however. Beginning in 1886 and continuing through 1887, a number of events were held. These were known as dime socials. One of these events was held at the farm of Mr. and Mrs. John Elmy. About 200 people attended. There was a profit of $18. By February of 1887, the folks had a grand total of $35 to begin erecting their little church.
This church, which stands within the bounds of the Old Fort, was aptly named the Old Fort Union Church. This title remained even after a group of Baptist worshipers took over for a short period. Methodists resumed worship here in 1898. At this time, F. Ray Andrews, a farmer living at the historic Potter Mansion, felt the call to preach. He was appointed permanent pastor at Friend. During his tenure while farming 500 acres of land, he also held both morning and evening services here. Reverend Andrews and his wife are buried across the road at the Old Fort Cemetery. With the appointment of Reverend Bruce Pierce in 1908, began the saga of various combinations and partnerships of Potter, Friend, Yatesville, Ely Valley, Benton, Bluff Point, and Vogue congregations, which lasted until 1943, the year I was born. During this period, 15 ministers came and went. Faithful laymen and women rang the bell, built the fire, and praised the Lord.
The 50th anniversary rededication of the church was held on a hot Sunday in July of 1939. The ceremony was opened by Mrs. Eliza Comstock, president of the Ladies' Aid Society. She offered a greeting of welcome to all who came. The pastor, speaking of all who came, counted 235 people at the Sunday dinner at noon on the lawn. There was an estimate of 275 people that were in and around the church when the service began. Think of this, just this little church, 275 people. This little church was crowded to the doors, with the pews full, chairs in the aisles, overflowing into the vestibule, out onto the porch, with many standing outside of the open windows. Pastors from all over New York State spoke. Music throughout the program included In the Sweet By and By, The Church in the Wildwood, The Old Rugged Cross, and God Be With You Till We Meet Again. The service was closed by Dr. E.E. Mehring, District Superintendent from Geneva.
From 1944 to 1975, Friend was in a cluster with Branchport and Bluff Point, with a parsonage in Branchport. During these years, various pastors ministered to these churches. From 1973 to 1975, no services were held here at the Little Friend Church. On July 11, 1976, Friend Church reopened as a one-point charge. Clayton Comstock came out of retirement to serve as pastor for 7 years. It was during this time that the church bought the Jerusalem number 13 schoolhouse. In November of 1976, lay leader Leslie Deinhardt and Pastor Comstock successfully bid on the schoolhouse, which is next door, for $5,060. Friend then had a dining room, a kitchen, bathroom, storage space, and an additional 1/2 acre of land. All of this was possible through donations and countless hours of volunteer labor to pay for the schoolhouse and to put it into shape with a new roof and porches.
In 1983, during the tenure of Reverend Steve Shea, the church was paneled, new lights were installed, and electric heat was added. Bob Deinhardt and Blanche Fitzwater before him got up early every Sunday morning during the winter to start the fire in the old wood stove at the Friend Church. And even after the advent of electric heat, that old wood stove was fired up every now and then. In a way, it symbolized the deep roots of the church and the deep roots that the folks around here had in their religion.
In 1985, a picnic shelter was erected in memory of Miriam Conley Pulver. July 5th, 1987 was another milestone for the Little Friend Church with the appointment of Friend's first woman pastor, Barbara Mortison Gifford. It was Pastor Gifford who led the parishioners in celebrating the 100th anniversary of the building of the Friend Sanctuary. It was Pastor Gifford's idea to invite former pastor Dan Benedict to don his circuit riding apparel and ride horseback into Friend to preach. His sermon, Building Churches, inspired those who came from all over New York State to respond with many resounding amens.
Thayetta Botsford Hall and Elizabeth Woodhouse came to represent their grandfather, Aishel Botsford, one of the volunteer carpenters who built the Friend Church 100 years before. The other volunteer church builder, Lorenzo Schofield, was represented by his granddaughter, Dorothy Schofield Plugall.
Throughout the 80s and 90s, in addition to the flourishing worship services, the church held the famous Friend Chicken Barbecue on every third Saturday of July, with people coming from all over to enjoy homemade baked beans, salads, and desserts. Old Home Day was always on the third Sunday of August, reuniting families and friends old and new. Ball and Bible activities were held throughout the summers for children from throughout the area. In more recent years, the Friend congregation has been ministered to by Reverends Maxine Peake, Renee Carrillo, Jay Yang, John Shortle, Betty Holden, and since 2007 by our kind and caring pastor, Tom Wonder. Now, when we worked with Tom many years ago, we and his fellow workers called him Mr. Wonderful. Now we call him Reverend Wonderful. Before we close, we would like to thank Alfredo Rollo, aka Fritz, for playing the hymns this evening that have been a part of the history of this church and its worshipers.
So now, you've heard much of the history of this little church. Scholars will tell you that history is a living thing. Well, this would lead us to believe that there is yet more to be written about this very special place. Each of you sitting here tonight is a part of that history. So, thank you for coming.
Amen.
Colleen and Basil, thank you so much. That was fascinating. Appreciate all the hard work that you did to present this to us. We have the pleasure of some area pastors who are helping out with the service this evening. And I'd like to call on Deb Rower from Benton, who will begin our service with the call to worship. If you would turn to number 125.
Please rise if you're able. The Canticle of Covenant Faithfulness. Seek the Lord who now is present. Call upon the Lord who is near.
Let the wicked forsake their way, let the unrighteous their thoughts.
Let them return, that the Lord may have mercy on them, that our God may abundantly pardon.
For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, says the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts.
For as the rain and the snow come down from heaven, and return not but water the earth, making it bring forth and sprout, giving seed to the sower and bread to the eater.
So shall my word be that goes forth from my mouth. It shall not return to me empty, but it shall accomplish that which I intend, and prosper in the thing for which I sent it.
And the opening prayer is number 335. Join me if you are called to do so. O God, the Holy Spirit, come to us and among us. Come as the wind and cleanse us. Come as the fire and burn. Come as the dew and refresh. Convict, convert, and consecrate many hearts and lives to our great good and to thy greater glory. And this we ask for Jesus Christ's sake. Amen.
Thank you, Deb.
Sure thing.
You may be seated. There's a change in our service this evening. After Jay Lonnie from Vine Valley reads our Old Testament and New Testament lessons, we'll join together in hymn number 534, Be Still My Soul. But first we'll have the Old Testament and New Testament lessons.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Our Old Testament lesson this evening is from Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. This is taken from the New Living Translation. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Do not depend on your own understanding. Seek his will in all you do, and he will show you which path to take. And our New Testament lesson comes from Philippians 4, 6 through 9, and this comes from the Message. Don't fret or worry. Instead of worrying, pray. Let petitions and praises shape your worries into prayers, letting God know your concerns. Before you know it, a sense of God's wholeness, everything coming together for good will come and settle you down. It's wonderful what happens when Christ displaces worry at the center of your life. Summing it all up, friends, I'd say you'll do best by filling your minds and meditation on things true, noble, reputable, authentic, compelling, gracious, the best, not the worst, the beautiful, not the ugly, things to praise, not things to curse. Put into practice what you learned from me, what you heard and saw and realized. Do that, and God, who makes everything work together, will work you into his most excellent harmonies. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Thank you, Jay. Hymn 534, please. I should tell you that the person who is recording this has come all the way from Finland to be with us. And if you'll notice, the name of this tune is Finlandia. Hey. In your honor, Adam. So. As I think about our history and the heritage that we have here, that we've only heard a smidgen of it. There are many more incredible stories. As I hear about the history, I remember with a smile our childhood neighbor, Margaret. My brother and sister and I spent a lot of time with her. She lived just around the corner. And she was about our age, but she is blessed still with a keen wit and a sense of observation. And she could do spot-on imitations of various people and certain kinds of attitudes. She could do the expressions, she could do the body language, she could do the manner of speech. And when she wanted to imitate an old person, she would sit in a rocking chair. She would rock slowly and she'd look around and say, "Things aren't the way they used to be." And it was something, obviously, I remember after a whole lot of years. Let me say right here and now that this attitude is found in people of all ages, and it doesn't necessarily define many of the older people that we know. Most of the older people that I know, especially a lot that have been powerful forces in our churches, are not that way at all. They have been a state of steady and faithful presence. They have been anything but resigned. They have no patience for a rocking chair. They're up and about. They're positive, energetic, industrious, no nonsense, and forward thinking. And we honor them today, and we remember with a smile and a tear those of this church who have recently left us. Thelma Conley, Lois and Graydon Bailey. And as I heard Colleen and Basil talk about some of the past pastors, we have lost two of them in the last several months. And that would be Renee Carrillo and Dan Benedict, have both passed away in recent months. So we remember all of these people. Thelma and Lois and Graydon and Dan all lived into their 90s and kept on going as long as they could. We look around and we know that things aren't the way they used to be. In fact, as we read the words of the Little Friend Church, I felt like I really needed to make some corrections. There have been some changes since 1944. For example, the bell isn't currently working, so we can't really talk about the bell. And the other thing is, every Sunday morning early, the church door is open wide. That is true. But Pastor is not there already because Pastor is coming from Yatesville and he's usually late. So there's a couple little changes there, but it wouldn't make for a very good song, I don't think. So we'll move on. So things are not the way they used to be. The church is not the center of the community. The church is not the center of many people's social lives. People these days are busy